Hi, friends. I wanted to talk to you today about food and our food habits, and the fact that we are completely, all of us, emotional eaters. Now, it's very common that everyone says that or hear that they're an emotional eater, and they might not really know what we mean by that, okay? Most of us just think about the fact that when maybe we're upset, we will eat sweet things in order to make ourselves feel a little bit better. And that is, of course, true, but it goes deeper than that, okay? So I want you to imagine that the relationship that you have with food might even have almost nothing to do with the idea of eating when you're hungry, and more so a question of your relationship with control over yourself and over your own life. As a parenthesis, before I continue, this is exactly what we see in some of the quite common, unfortunately, diseases that we have these days linked to our relationship to food, to, for instance, starve ourselves completely or to binge and then maybe even get rid of the food by throwing up. Okay, so of course I'm talking about anorexia and bulimia. And these diseases actually have nothing to do with food itself, of course. It even doesn't really have maybe that much to do with the body image and what we see on in the commercials and things like that of what a body should look like. I'm not saying that it has nothing to do with it, but the root cause is actually not really that. It's something that they fixate on, but it comes from this need of control. Okay, so it's a question of controlling their own environment, controlling what they put into their bodies, controlling what their bodies are expressing and what they do and look like. Okay, which means that what is the body if not actually our expression, physical manifestation of ourselves? So keep that in mind when I talk about food, because in the posts that I've done this week about food habits, I have given some pointers on things to maybe have a look at or do differently, create some awareness around and change, because it's actually maybe not so good for us to do the things that we've always been doing. Remembering that we had this idea at one point in time where we decided that we should have 3 meals a day, for instance. I'm not saying anything against the fact of having 3 meals a day. I'm just saying that this is a construction that we've made, and we start out in life, not at all with that idea, of course, because basically when we start out, we're basically sleeping, pooping, eating, clock around, right? And so around the clock, I mean. And little by little, our dear parents train us into having these 3, let's say, or how many you have where you're from, maybe 5, if you count the snacks. And that is more a question of convenience than anything else, because we have been instructed into fitting into this structure that society has us in, okay? And so basically, they train us into eating at these times, and it might not even be the times when we would naturally be hungry, maybe. And maybe even there would be times when you would be hungry, and then apparently it's not meal time at that time. And if you are anything like me, that conditioning early on in life really created a rather complicated relationship to the mealtime, because also not only can the child actually decide on the mealtime, but can't really decide on what to eat either. Okay. But the thing is, actually, and this is where I really want to catch your attention, we have a survival instinct, as I often say, and that all of us know, and that survival instinct wouldn't actually allow for us really to starve. The reason that we starve, when people starve to death, it's not people who are living in abundant society like we are, where there's a fridge and you just open it and there's anything you want in there. Okay, starvation doesn't come there. So actually, when we are hungry, we will eat, whether we wait longer than our parents were expecting or not. Okay, so it's important to remember that it is very much, and without putting the blame on anything, but it's very much a question of learning what's convenient for the people who brought us into this life, the parents. And so naturally, I will see that letting the 3-year-old decide when and what to eat is basically mayhem in total. And I'm not saying that that would not be that would be a good thing to do. What I'm saying is that we have been trained by society to eat at certain times and eat certain things, and it's a question of an evolution which is far from actually our own physical needs, but much more linked to economical reasons and productivity and these kind of things, okay? So when I first started thinking about how I deal with food, I realized, number one, that most of the things that I do in life, like the reasons I studied the certain things, or that I'm living where I am now, or that I'm working on these kind of things, so the online courses that I've developed are actually based very much in this complicated struggle that I've had my whole life related to food habits. Because it also is identity very much linked in there. And I could never imagine when I started looking into this, which was, of course, by seeking weight loss that I started looking into it. I wanted to lose weight, and of course I knew, because I have understood that by not eating, I will also reduce the body fat. Okay, but what I didn't understand was, how can I continue to just starve myself and then lose maybe the weight that I wanted to, and then continue in life anyway. And that's probably the struggle of many of us. And this is a question very much for women, I know, but actually it is also more now maybe than it used to be, definitely a question for men as well. In both actually sense, so there's the part of losing weight and having then a complicated relationship to food due to that, but actually for a lot of men, there's the opposite side as well, okay? So there's this idea about eating more in order to kind of bulk up and become bigger, because there's this fear of becoming skinny if you're not eating. And the situation can look then the opposite, but there's still this emotional relationship to food. So it is far beyond the idea of nurturing, okay? So most of us have a little bit lost, even if we say it consciously, we've probably lost the original meaning of eating, which is to nurture the body, and then instead developed all these other habits around it, which are emotionally linked. Because there's also, of course, the link of what happens at the time that we eat. It's a moment when we're together with other people. And as a child, it's the moment that you get the attention from, or in the beginning, maybe just the mother if she's breastfeeding you, for instance, but then later on as well, of course, all the other people in the family and the father and so. So it's something we link, of course, then to attention, therefore belonging, therefore love, therefore community, survival in the most strongest of its essence, okay? So there's very little at the end of the day maybe linked to our relationship to just nurturing ourselves. And I myself, when I was then looking into how can I lose weight, which was what my goal was then, yet I don't want to starve myself. And so it was hard for me to understand that maybe it was not so much that I was maybe looking in the wrong direction. Maybe actually the way that I was having my relationship to food in itself, like how I ate, what I ate, and all of that, maybe that was what I needed to change. And of course, what this means is that I had an image, I had these beliefs that were truths for me. So I had an image of who I am. And I had a narrative around my relationship to food, of course, and that I was being very true to, because that was my reality. It was the glasses that I was wearing, and naturally the world could not look another way. And it also played out just as funnily that I would then have moments where I lost weight, would be very happy about that, but then anxious around it, because then all I could really focus on was how to not gain again what I had lost. And of course I would, of course, because my belief was that this was not me, but this was an alternated version of me. That was what I was really wanting to be, but it wasn't really me. So at some point, the body would go back into the state that it was in before. And those of you who have a little bit lost me here when I say this, you can have a look at my talks around limiting beliefs and self-image, and you can even get the masterclass on self-image that I have, or you can even go into Psycho-Cybernetics by Max Maltz. Have a look on Google and you will see some very interesting things linked to self-image and how we just become what the thoughts in our head has decided that we are. So I would lose the weight and then I would put it back on again because somewhere there was this decision that this is what I was supposed to look like, okay? And so I realized as well while I was looking into this that some foods we had a more complicated relationship to. And it was always the foods, of course, that weren't good for us that were the ones that we would be drawn towards. And then the other ones that were actually perfectly fine, we weren't very drawn to. We had no specific relationship to them. And also, even more so, there were people who would have huge difficulties with how to eat and others who wouldn't at all. So some people will forget meals, whereas others will act as if there's no more food around, so constantly eating. So naturally, because we all have our human body, even if they have a different constitution, we still have more or less the same needs, so there wouldn't really be a biological reason that some of us would rarely think about food or did not have a difficult relationship to it, and then others would be in the idea of there's a crisis and I need to eat constantly. Okay, so there was obviously then to me something beyond our biological needs for food. And there was one thing that took me many, many years to even accept and look into, because I would not see in what way this would have a relationship to me putting on or not weight or being fat or thin or whatever I thought myself to be. And that was the time spent sitting down at mealtime, and more so the speed in which I ate. And it took me a very long time to understand that even though I was certain that I was actually not eating very much and yet I would put on weight, what it was more linked to the speed of eating. Because when I ate slower, I actually realized that I needed less. So, if you have ever been brought up in a house where you finish your plate before you leave the table, then you have been instructed very early on in life to not trust your own signals of I'm satisfied, but instead of the guilt and the shame and everything that's linked to pleasing the parents. So eating up, even if you didn't like it, even if you had enough or whatever, even if you weren't even hungry. So already from early on, we had switched off our natural kind of meter, our hunger satisfaction meter, all right? So as you can imagine, we have a lot of issues with food, not only in that we link food to something emotional, a situation of belonging. We link food also to pleasing our parents, and we definitely do not link food as much to where is my level of satisfaction and when I'm done. Okay? So basically what I want to narrow it down to is that there is only one thing really that helps for us when we start to look into how we eat and maybe considering changing the way we deal with food, the way we eat, the way we handle food, and what we eat. And that is to actually treat the eating for what it is, an addiction, especially when it's not serving us, because an addiction is the continuing of a habit against adverse results. So basically doing things that aren't serving us and we keep doing them anyway. And that is very often what we do with food, and which is what we see in the world around us as well, with the obesity that's just gone through the roof, or just eating the wrong things, or then on the contrary, treating ourselves by with like a punishment, for the food. So not eating, starving, or binge, throwing up, and all of that. And so what we need to understand is that the same way we find it hard to understand that we are actually completely addicted to our thoughts, we are also completely addicted to the way we eat and what we have a tendency to eat. So the posts that I've made this week around this are small pointers for beginning to create the awareness around it. And when I did my fast, the Aerobic fast, which is not where you don't eat or only drink water or anything like that, you eat just the same thing for a certain amount of days, you start to realize just how much it is an addiction and how much it's an emotional triggered addiction. Because when you can only eat one same thing, you will not go around starving, but you will be bored, or you will lose interest, or you will simply eat less maybe, or even more, because actually all these triggers comes to the surface. And triggers coming to the surface, what is it? Unless it's simply our unconscious parts coming into the surface, beginning to knock on the door, saying there are things here that belong to you, but that you have not really dealt with. Okay, so that means when you start to do, you don't have to do necessarily the Ayurvedic fast that I did, but when you start as simple as paying attention to your hunger levels at the times of meals, okay, and maybe looking into how you feel after the meal as well, to notice if you actually pay attention to when you're full or not, or if you finished the plate, when you might not would have finished it, you know what I mean? And also, in an even more so, not eating if you're not hungry. And even having a look into, if I'm hungry, and if you are anything like me, for as long as I can remember, it would be this panicking feeling almost. I'm hungry, I need to eat, and it's like the world is going to come to an end. And when I then have the food in front of me, then I eat it also very, very fast, as if there was all these other people around me who would steal the food otherwise. And I wasn't born in a house with 7 children. I had a brother and a sister, and actually they left quite early because I was the youngest. So there was not really anyone that was fighting with me for the food. So where does that come from? Now that's personal for each and one of us. I'm not going to tell you it comes from this and this and that. All I'm saying is begin to ask questions around the habits that you have with food, and when you eat, and maybe even what would happen if you wouldn't eat, all right? If you would just allow yourself to be hungry, is that something that would be a frustrating trigger for you? And how would you deal with that frustration? Because I promise you, you're not going to die just because you're hungry. Of course, it's not a good thing to walk around hungry all the time. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, notice, become curious around your eating habits. Now, in both of my online courses, the second one, which is almost done and coming up very, very soon, the food in itself and your relationship to food isn't necessarily the central point, but it's completely linked to it for the self-image project and for the self-knowledge project, which is Ayurvedic based. And both of these then have an access to the third course, which is 100% linked to your food habits, because it is actually on habit formation and how to recognize and then reverse by changing without the struggle of severage and pushing yourself and trying to motivate yourself and willpower. none of that actually is needed to change the habits that you've formed since many years. All right. Thank you.